Welcome to the Weekly Squeak, your weekly geeky squeak with me, Christian Schiller. For more information on the podcast, please go to christianschiller.com/podcasts. I'm speaking to you from another random hotel room. Conference season is still in full swing. I am in Minsk on the side of an extremely noisy road. I can hear it even if you can't. A slightly different episode this week. I'm not going to present my favorite links because I have a large backlog of interviews from the recent KubeCon conference I was at, and I would rather get those out to you. So I actually have 3 interviews for you this week, all loosely around the topic of Kubernetes, DevOps, cloud computing, etc., etc. So if you're not into those topics, this may not be the episode for you, but still, you might be interested in hearing what people have to say. So the 3 interviews are, in this order, Jason McGee from IBM, and then following from that, I have Carmine Rimi from Canonical, and then finally, I have an interview with Sheng Liang from Rancher Labs. And we discuss Kubernetes, current state of cloud computing, new tools, new releases, all from a quite exciting conference that, unfortunately, I did not get to spend as much time at as I would have liked. And probably next week, I will have some more interviews from KubeCon. But in the meantime, enjoy.
So I'm Jason McGee. I work for IBM. I run cloud platform for the public cloud side of IBM's cloud business. So kind of everything, platform as a service, Kubernetes, serverless, Istio, that whole space.
Okay. And I guess what's your interest in being here?
Well, I mean, obviously,
fairly obvious.
Yeah, it's somewhat fairly obvious. I mean, as a major cloud vendor, we believe in cloud native. We've been doing Kubernetes and containers for 5 years, and so we're here to talk about what we're doing, to meet with clients, and to contribute to the community. We're big contributors in many of the projects that are part of CNCF.
I mean, I guess IBM has a fairly well-known audience in particular sectors, and then maybe isn't known so well for other users of cloud vendors. So how do you compete with some of the bigger names, and what do you do differently, I guess, to do that?
Yeah, so there's probably kind of 2 dimensions to that. I mean, the cloud market, I think, is an interesting space. There's a handful of kind of big global players. We're in that group. We have a global public cloud. I think we are more slanted towards enterprise. So if you kind of look at the kind of spectrum of users, we certainly lean more towards what are the needs of an enterprise market developer. As part of that, we've had I think historically a stronger kind of hybrid slant to our cloud strategy, a combination of public and private cloud dimension to our strategy than some of the others have, although you start to see them come around to that. So we're after, how can we help enterprises make this journey to cloud, move not only the new things they're building, but also how do they take the 80% of existing apps they have and find a way to bring them into cloud as well.
So is it less off the shelf and more kind of consulting, or somewhere between the two?
It's both. I mean, IBM's is probably the only end-to-end tech company anymore where we have both product and consulting services. So on the product side, we have a global public cloud that we run in 30 plus countries around the world that people can use as a platform for hosting their applications. We have clients like American Airlines and Harley Davidson and Maersk and others who use that as their public cloud. We also have a private cloud stack that we offer that's aligned with our public cloud that people run in their data center or run themselves on other clouds like Amazon and Azure. And then, of course, we have a pretty rich collection of consulting services that can go with that to advise people on how to move to cloud, to do the work for them, to run systems for them, whatever they need.
Some people might know already, but what are some of the services you currently offer? And then we'll talk about what you're going to be offering, but what do you currently offer?
From a cloud service, the more the product side. So our public cloud is kind of a full spectrum. So, of course, on the public side, we have infrastructure services, compute network storage. I think one of the differentiators we've had there has been a strong bare metal capability in our cloud that, has served us well with clients, and we use for our VMware offerings and other things. In the platform space, we have a managed Kubernetes service called IKS, IBM Cloud Kubernetes. That's really the foundation for most of the rest of our cloud. cloud. So, we have a Cloud Foundry service. We have a serverless platform called Cloud Functions. We have higher level capabilities like database as a service, AI and ML with Watson, all of that. So kind of that whole stack is available in our cloud. Most of that itself runs on Kubernetes, right? So we have quite a lot of operational experience on kind of using container platforms as part of a production system. And then, a subset of that stack is also available in private cloud, right, as a Kubernetes-based stack.
And I'm guessing because your peak client base is enterprise, then there's a lot of hybrid cloud offerings too.
Right. I mean,
easy to do.
Yeah, relatively. Yeah. So I think we have a pretty comprehensive stack where you can run both public and private and mix the two together. Recently, we've announced capabilities like multi-cloud management. So tools to help you kind of manage across environments. I mean, think about things like take somebody who's decided on Kubernetes and they're running, as inevitably happens with Kubernetes, you run tens or dozens of clusters of Kubernetes in different places. How do you see what's running in all of those? How do you set constant security policy or application policies? So we have tools that allow you to do that very easily and kind of set up, especially in an enterprise context. Think about like a security officer who says, like, I want the network policy for Kubernetes to be the same in all my clusters. How do you do that easily? So we've built tools like that with multi-cloud management. And so, it's easy for people to kind of set up both dimensions. I think the other part of kind of enterprise is things like security and compliance and isolation. So, for example, our Kubernetes offering on the public cloud, you can order, if you want, fully isolated clusters, meaning they run on dedicated hardware if you want. That's not shared by anybody on, of course, isolated networks. They can be fully managed but totally disconnected from the internet. So they're only accessible from the corporate network through a direct link or something. And so if you even just think about kind of how we surface them, we've tried to think through, what does an enterprise need? What are some of the unique requirements that they have?
And I guess, so what are you at KubeCon to talk about or to promote maybe new features or announcements, or what are you here to promote?
Sure,
just general.
So apart from just awareness of our capabilities and telling about our contributions in the space, I think the new thing this week is we're going to announce a new open source project that we're creating called RASI. RASI is really a continuous delivery framework for cloud native microservices. So one of the challenges we found when we were running Kubernetes is we run in our managed Kubernetes service well over 10,000 clusters around the world. Inside of all those clusters, we manage software on behalf of the user. And so how do you manage that? How do you do microservice rollout to 10 or 20,000 locations? How do you have flexibility around, what gets updated when and how that update process works? And we started with a very traditional kind of Jenkins, triggered CD process, and quickly found that at that kind of scale and in the microservice world, that didn't work very well. It was incredibly complex. So we built a system that which we call RASI, which is kind of a rules-based, pull-oriented CD framework that we think is really good for kind of managing complex microservice environments. We're open sourcing that stuff, and we're starting to build it into our multi-cloud management tools and integrating with the community.
And apart from it being another open source offering, I'm guessing it also integrates fairly well into the existing tool chains you have.
Absolutely. So we use it ourselves. We're starting, one of the things it does really well is it also gives you a view of inventory, like what's running everywhere in your fleet, right? And that's a problem that lots of enterprises actually need solved. Like if you think about how do you run compliant workloads, for example, on a Kubernetes platform, you need to know exactly what version of every container was running when did it get updated, so you can prove compliance and all that kind of boring stuff. And RASI gives you all of that kind of information. So we're surfacing it in our products to our users. But we think it's an interesting approach to continuous delivery. It's something I think the community hasn't quite nailed yet, is if we really all believe in microservices and we're going to have this multi-cloud environment with clusters all over the place, like how do you actually manage that from a CD perspective? And so we think there's value.
Why do you think the community hasn't nailed it? There's lots of options available. What are they not doing quite right. I mean, apart from everything being slightly separate, of course.
Yeah.
What
So
are they not doing?
what I think they're not doing so far is there's kind of two, I think, fundamental ideas in RASI that we found really flipped it for us. One was going from push to pull oriented. So if you think about like how your phone updates, it's a pull oriented model, right? Like all the phones in the world go check in with some server somewhere to see if there's updates available, and they pull them down and update themselves. That's the way RASI works too. It's not the way people traditionally do CD. CD is usually like you have a pipeline in something like Jenkins, and after you get through some gates, then you go push the changes into all your environments, which works when you have like dev test prod, but doesn't work when you have, 100 environments or 1,000 environments that you have to go after. And it doesn't work because of the second dimension, which is like the rules about when you want to update what. So like, for example, one of our problems was, let's say we're running in 6 major regions in the world. We want to roll out a change. We want to start it in Australia where we have a smaller customer base, and eventually roll it to the US where we have a big customer base. Or like kind of coding all those kinds of rules into a traditional CD system is hard.
Usually like feature flags and things like that.
And in fact, what we did in RASI exactly was we modeled everything as feature flags. We used Launch Darkly as our kind of feature flag system to essentially represent every cluster in the world as a target that we can write rules against, right?
And it might be like a more consistent rollout. Like we update 3 a.m. Eastern time every day, even if there's nothing there. But
right. I mean, so the clusters kind of self-check in every minute to see if there's something available. If I was going to do a global rollout, but you didn't want yours updated right now, it'd be easy for me to kind of opt you out. And so it just gave us a ton more flexibility on disconnecting kind of the CI pipeline from the CD pipeline, and then having the CD side be really flexible about who gets updated and how it happens. And it scaled better, to be honest.
And is that directly, it's a Kubernetes plugin, or it could run separately in Kubernetes, or
I mean it certainly is kind of optimized around running Kubernetes oriented things. It itself just runs as a container, like the update part of it runs as a container inside the cluster, and then there's some infrastructure on the server side for storing configurations, storing rules, applying these rules.
And how do people define that rule? Is it YAML as well?
Yeah, it's YAML as always. No need to reinvent that stuff.
From your offering over there, is there like a sort of visual builder as well, or is it all just configuration?
The UI part of it is more the UI for inventory of what's running where and rules definition, right? Like I want to change this rule and therefore apply those changes. There's not a lot in the definition of the package itself, although most of the packages themselves that you're employing are just YAML. They're just, you can use Helm, of course, but they're just mostly Kubernetes YAML, collections of YAML that represent a service, a container, a deployment spec, something like that.
And are there any major users that you can or can't talk about yet, apart from yourself?
There's not some that we can talk about publicly yet. And part of this is just about getting the ideas out there. I mean, there's actually been a ton of activity in the kind of CI/CD space recently. We're also heavily involved in projects like Knative and Tecton Pipelines. And so I think this is all in that space. And so really our intention is to get the ideas out there, figure out how it might fit in with some of these other things. So I don't know, in the long term, it's like we want RASI to be, it's like a project by itself. It's similar actually to Istio. IBM, my team at IBM was kind of the half of the founding team of Istio. We had a prior open source project that we had created called Amalgamate that was kind of our lead into what became Istio. And, we got together with the Google guys actually at KubeCon a few years ago and kind of joined forces and wound up creating what is now Istio. And I think things like this will probably follow a similar trajectory.
And there's been a waning of some older CIs recently for various reasons as well, so maybe there's a gap for some new players as well.
And I think there is, and like I said, I think a lot of the CI/CD stuff hasn't really changed to kind of represent what's going on now with microservice-based development, with container-based development. Like they've been adapted, and that works fine at a certain level, but like if I looked at my own team and as we were building our managed kube service, we had like 45 microservices that made up that internal implementation. It was like, how did I even allow my own team independently to be able to deploy and update that across this huge fleet? So you needed a different approach, right?
For people who haven't used IBM Cloud before, where do you feel it sits on in terms of I guess, the casual developer to begin with being able to dabble. Like some clouds can be fairly complicated to get started with, and others can be simpler, but you hit a wall quickly. Like,
yeah.
How easy is it, especially to kind of mesh some of those services you offer? And
I'm obviously not an unbiased speaker, but I actually think we've spent a lot of time over the last few years really thinking about how to make it easy for people to consume. And I think we have, in the kind of PaaS space especially, we have a pretty strong set of capabilities. IBM over the last 5+ years has spent a lot of time on design and have like one of the best kind of corporate design practices in the world. And we've applied a lot of that skill to our cloud and what that cloud experience is. So I think getting going is actually very simple. It's really easy to get kube clusters going. It's really easy to build apps. The wall part, I don't know that there's an explicit wall, but obviously with all technologies, there comes a point where you have to go a little deeper.
You have some interesting offerings on IBM Cloud, like Hyperledger and in Watson, which are somewhat unique.
Right.
And I don't exactly know if you want to connect them, but whatever.
Yeah, no.
But still, it could be possible. And you kind of have the ability to create some quite nuanced projects with not just infrastructure, but some other aspects.
I agree. And if you look at IBM's history, like, my personal history, I'm an old app server guy. Like, I was one of the leads for WebSphere. And so, like, the whole application space and application middleware is kind of how we think. And today, that's really PaaS in the cloud world. And so we've spent a lot of time there, and composability, like this idea of having this catalog of APIs that you can easily wire together, is something that has always been at the foundation of how we thought about how IBM Cloud would work. And so you can take things like, I want to build a containerized app on Kube or a Cloud Foundry app and leverage blockchain and call Watson APIs and like glue all that together. And there's some pretty compelling examples where you can build some stuff pretty fast that way, right?
Speaking of gluing things together, I don't know, I'm guessing this is a subject you're okay to talk about, I'm not sure, but how has bringing in a lot of Red Hat's cloud technologies been going? I think I actually spoke to some people from Red Hat when it first happened, and it was still in that phase. This was a few months ago. So.
Yeah, I mean, we're still a little bit in that phase. So, we've stated our intention to acquire them. It's not closed.
Oh, okay.
It'll close in the second half of the year. But I think generally, we've been working with Red Hat for a long time in open source, over 20 years, actually. I mean, IBM put $1 billion into Linux over 20 years ago and helped really create the ecosystem that allowed Linux to flourish. So I think overall we're pretty aligned on the tech stack that underpins what people are doing, and I think bringing Red Hat into the picture is mostly a recognition of the role of hybrid in the phase of cloud that we're going into. Like, it's overgeneralization, but you could argue that this kind of first round of cloud was mostly kind of new app development, extensions of existing apps being built in the cloud.
Yeah.
We're now trying to figure out how to take all that other hard stuff and bring it in. Yeah. And that's going to require hybrid. And you see all of my competitors off coming up with their own flavors of hybrid offerings and stuff to try to deal with that, right? And I think Red Hat is part of strengthening that.
It's actually a nice, there's some controversy in the cloud vendors, although really only with one, of not being particularly good open source citizens. Whereas a lot of the smaller, in quote marks, players have been way better as a point of differentiation. Yeah. And you've already mentioned a few open source contributions, but I guess like for you, or not for you as a company, where does looking after the business and making sure that the open source underpinnings are a healthy kind of stop and start?
Yeah. So look, open source and kind of open technology has been one of the core principles of our cloud approach from the beginning. And I think IBM over the last 20 years has been actually very consistent about open source and contributions. And for that to work, you need healthy projects, right? So we actually invest a lot of time and labor in those projects. We spend a lot of time on governance and making sure that those projects are not only strong technically, but have a governance structure around them that allows them to flourish. And, CNCF as a foundation, IBM helped with, and OCI and lots of other things. And so, that's like, we have to keep the base healthy, and then we take that and we make it available in our products. And sometimes that's, most of the time it's kind of a packaging and integration. Like in the public cloud, it's actually easier in my mind because the value prop is we run this as a service for you, and there's a ton of value in setting up and keeping it secure and updated and available and all of that kind of operations around a stack like Kubernetes, and we can do that for you. In the private cloud, I think it's more about integrating all the pieces together. I mean, even just like at CNCF, like how many projects are there in CNCF? And for the average customer to say like, I'm going to self-assemble all these pieces and then keep them all up to date and secure, like that's actually a lot of work. Yeah. And so there's a value prop in bringing that together as a platform.
And I guess what sort of percentage of your offerings, ignoring or adding the infrastructure and the consultancy, which is a thing that only a particular company can offer because that's you.
Right.
How much of the various technologies you have do you keep kind of closed source to yourselves versus being open?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the percentages are to put a real number on that. All of the new things that we've been doing are certainly all based on open technologies, whether that's blockchain with Hyperledger, obviously in the cloud native space with Kube and Cloud Foundry and serverless and all kinds of things that we've done in that space. In some of our legacy businesses, there's obviously more proprietary code there, in MQ messaging and business process management and things like that. But even in those cases, what we're starting to do is package and optimize those things to run on this new platform, right? So people can leverage the kind of operational efficiencies of Kubernetes to run their existing, MQ applications or WebSphere app server applications and things like that. So there's a mix, but most of the new things, if you look at Watson, there's lots of open source that underpins Watson. We've been pretty consistent, I think, in this idea, especially, the place to look most of the time is like, where does it touch the code or application that the user is going to create? Like if there's a touch point of some artifact they're going to build, we want that artifact to be an open source, open standard, right? So that they have freedom of action with that artifact, because that's where their time investment is, right? Yeah. And so that's where we tend to look the most. Whereas, sometimes with management tools or management experience or things around it, maybe that will likely be product stuff and less open source stuff, right?
With a lot of traditional enterprise vendors, maybe thinking of a handful, switching to very similar business models of starting to move most of their services to cloud offerings, a kind of something as PaaS, SaaS, whatever.
Right. Yeah, something as a service. Yeah. Right.
So they're all starting to do a lot of similar things to each other. I guess how do you think you will all and IBM especially differentiate from Microsoft and Google to a certain extent, and all the other companies starting to do similar things with their traditional business?
Yeah. So I think it's going to be a few things. I mean, one is our knowledge of enterprise really does influence the subtleties of how we build those things. So like how you do security and isolation, how you do contracting for cloud, how you enable them to do encryption and key management. Like there's a lot of subtle detail that can become the inhibitor for taking something as a service and actually being able to use it in an enterprise context. And I think, we understand that stuff better than anyone else, and we're building that into kind of how our cloud works. I think the hybrid thing shouldn't be underplayed. Most of our competitors do not really have a comprehensive hybrid strategy where the same stack is available in a consistent way between on-prem and off. Some of them are trying to get there. Some of them have been trying, but to be successful, that's going to have to be real, right? And we have lots of clients who are doing that, where they're using public cloud for some things, they're using private cloud for others. They need those to be consistent. Those decisions change over time. So I think that hybrid notion is really key. It's funny, 4 years ago, IBM got a lot of flack, I think, for talking a lot about hybrid, and there was maybe a mindset in the industry that hybrid wasn't real cloud. Right. And now everyone's doing something in hybrid, right? Because it's just the reality. It's just pragmatic reality of IT. Like, 20, 30, 50 years of IT investment doesn't just all change overnight. No. Even if we all believe cloud is the ultimate model, it's, there's a long period where we're going to need both.
And just for redundancy more than anything else.
Right.
Putting all your eggs in one basket is never a good.
Well, sure. And that's where I think like the multi-cloud dimension comes in as well. It's like, okay, even if you believe in cloud or you've moved all to public cloud, do you want all one vendor? Do you want multiple vendors? Like, so that's the reality that I think we all have to deal with.
We'll have on-premise stuff probably running in IE6 or something.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing goes away.
You need to access somehow. Exactly. So I guess what's on the roadmap for the next 6 months?
There's always interesting stuff happening in the roadmap.
You can talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we're still kind of playing out this platform. I think we're in this interesting transition period that I alluded to of customers trying to figure out how to move, the more mission critical systems into the cloud. And so taking Kubernetes and all the things that go around it and helping them be successful at that is really the focus. How that plays out, I mean, I think there's things like Istio, which are, from a technology standpoint, are mature, but are still early in their adoption phase, which I think will have a huge impact on how people leverage these systems and how they solve for security and other dimensions. I think Knative as a tech stack is the next kind of 2019, early 2020 thing that's like, all right, how do you bring functions and apps into the picture and have that part of the stack be consistent? So I think those are areas where we're doing a lot of work on not only helping the projects, but building it into our platforms and building the tools around it to help people be successful leveraging those things.
Name's Carmine Rimi. I work for Canonical as a product manager for Kubernetes and artificial intelligence.
That's an interesting mix of portfolios. How do they cross over?
Great question. So in the AI space, we offer and package Kubeflow. Kubeflow is open source by Google, and it is a Kubernetes native application. So what it does, it actually bundles a lot of the popular frameworks like TensorFlow, PyTorch, MXNet, as well as they've come to market with their own components, something called Kati, which is hyperparameter tuning, plus pipelines, which is workflow, and make that all available to the community as easy to consume, easy to deploy, composable, portable, scalable, artificial intelligence, leveraging Kubernetes underneath and the mechanisms it provides, including things like GPU awareness and stuff like that.
And it's a very good an interesting combination. I had heard of Kubeflow and had kind of forgotten about it, actually. And I've been playing with TensorFlow recently, so maybe I should have remembered. Are you the only vendor to offer it together, or the others do?
I think at the moment we may be, but there's certainly plenty of other vendors participating in the community. Microsoft, Amazon, of course, Google, IBM Cloud. Those are all popular names, including even Red Hat. Everybody is participating in that community. I think they see the value of what they're trying to do. They've kept it pretty open and pretty easy to extend and operate. But it also is a part of that community, making it easy for other people to participate and probably leveraging the similar kind of dynamics you see in Kubernetes to make things like pluggability and extensibility, like CSI, CNI, those kinds of things are part of, I think, the ecosystem and the ethos that goes into Kubeflow as well.
And I think it's only been around for less than a year, I think.
Yeah, well, just over a year and a half. We just published the 0.5 release. So each quarter there's a release for Kubeflow. They're aggressively marching towards a 1.0. I think the 1.0 will be very similar to what you see in Kubernetes, where some components will be GA, some will be beta, some will be alpha, and then things will just progress over time. So rather than the entire platform being 1.0, it's more likely that the underlying harness, the microkernel, if you will, plus some key components, all will be 1.0, GA, and then everything else beta and alpha. Yeah.
So, I mean, as public as you can be, what have people been building with Kubeflow over the past 18 months with Canonical?
Sure. Yeah. Well, we find it. So it's still in the early stages. So a lot of people are doing development and training of their models using Kubeflow. We find slightly different to Kubernetes with Kubeflow on top of MicroK8. So MicroK8 is our single node, easy to install. It's a snap install MicroK8, and you have a fully formed compliant Kubernetes cluster. So the idea of ephemeral stacks comes up. So because it's so quick and so fast, whether it's in your own private cloud or it's in a public cloud, so imagine Google, GCP, or AWS, you have some scripts that will quickly and easily spin up a single node of whatever size, which can be quite massive, right? So imagine a massive workstation. Plus, with Google, you can associate a number of GPUs. install microcates, install Kubeflow on top of that, do your training, and at the end of that, you've got a model that you can just then output, tear the whole thing down, and you're done.
So apart from Kubeflow, I just got interested and we kept started going. What else is Canonical here to, well, at KubeCon, I guess you're the right person to be here, but what else are you here to specifically promote or talk about?
It's primarily those two projects, Kubernetes and Kubeflow. But in addition to that, of course, it's our operating system. Ubuntu is used everywhere in all the public clouds. So if you look at, and actually I should take a couple steps back. It's not just our offering of Kubernetes, both the what we call the Charm distribution of Kubernetes and microcates. We also support the public cloud offerings for Kubernetes. So whether it's EKS, GKE, AKS, they all, underneath the covers, operate on top of Ubuntu. The worker nodes are on top of Ubuntu. And so even just at that level of the operating system being prevalent in all these different public clouds means that we can support our customers and other customers in that space. Of course, with our own distribution, we do have a multi-cloud story. So our distribution of Kubernetes with the automation technology we have around it can easily deploy and set up clusters of 1,000, 5,000 nodes in any of those public clouds, plus on-prem with the VMware, directly on bare metal, on OpenStack. And so we have, I think, probably the widest spectrum of deployment targets that we support, and we support at a very low cost. Compared to our competitors, we actually have a product called Ubuntu Advantage for Infrastructure, and you get all of this, the operating system support, plus OpenStack if you need it, plus Kubernetes, at an extremely low price.
I'd be interested to know, I mean, Canonical with Ubuntu has tried a lot of experiments in the past, some of which have been more successful than others. And I think the container trend has been pretty good for Ubuntu. So how much has that changed, I guess, the path of development versus its other use cases that people might know? And how big of a part of I guess roadmap is it now?
Sure. Yeah. I think a very big part. We certainly have our Kubernetes team, but we also do invest in the entire landscape. The operating system itself, as you're pointing out, you do have containers now. You had virtual machines as well, and all of those are sort of slightly different form factors, if you will, for the actual operating system. And whether or not you want a fully fledged operating system or you want a minimal version of that operating system. And we cover that whole spectrum so that we can cover you for a container, we can cover you for a virtual machine. And before containers, you can imagine the space was slightly different in terms of creating virtual machines. How do you sort of stand up virtual machines in terms of the underlying infrastructure and hypervisor? That still is a big part for a lot of companies. As you know, I think we're still in the early part of the adoption curve for Kubernetes. There's a lot of exciting projects, a lot of things going on.
It feels so big and mature already.
Well, it is big and mature, but then when you get into what surprises me, I think you've written about DevOps in the past. What surprises me is how many organizations don't do DevOps or still haven't done DevOps. And if you're not doing DevOps, sure, you can do containers and somebody's manually, once a week, once a month, pushing the button, they build, and all of a sudden they got a container. But I think Kubernetes and containers really shine when you start thinking about CI/CD pipelines. I've got a friend who's working for a company here in Europe, and this company is a conglomerate. They've acquired a lot of other sort of separate companies, have hundreds of products actually in technology. And within that company, these practices that we're talking about, CI/CD, Kubernetes, containers, microservice architecture, isn't native. It's actually quite,
There is still this difference between just building on the cloud and cloud native, and I think that's the phase we're in. Actually, the last time I was at this venue for Mobile Congress, where it's a much bigger mix of companies, I spoke with an Italian telco where they just switched to kind of cloud native, and the things they were able to now do, they were sort of quite exuberant about. It was quite interesting to hear this very traditional company like, oh, now we're doing this and we're doing that and we're moving so much quicker and trying all these crazy ideas. And to me, it just felt like, well, duh. But, to them, it was still quite new. And that's actually what they were talking about, was trying to convince other enterprise companies to make this switch like they had and how much benefit it had brought to them.
You bring up a good point. You find that a lot. If you are an early adopter, than you might have adopted something 2-3 years ago, and you kind of forget, similar to having kids and it becomes Christmas or something like that, right? You sort of forget the joy that other people experience when they first come around this, and all of the headaches that it solves. I started the cloud team at Workday. And one of the things that we tried to do there, one of my missions was to have a software-defined data center. Up until that time, the data center itself and how servers get created, racks, virtual machines, was a very manual process. Filing tickets, taking 2 weeks, all of those classic things. That's still true in a lot of different places. With Kubernetes, obviously a lot of that stuff goes away. With micro-K8s, being able to actually take advantage of this latest stuff directly on your own laptop, I think helps some of these organizations that haven't adopted it start to get a sense for, an idea for what this thing can do. And in terms of those early adopters or innovators, which I think is one of the things that we target as a company, is who are those innovators that are trying to create things? What's some of the friction that they experience in their consumption of open source, and then how can we eliminate that? So that's why you see things like our micro-K8s, our CDK, our Snap technology as well. All of the things go a long way towards making it easy for innovators to consume open source, and then also will help solve some of the boring, complex things that have nothing to do with your business, right?
I'd be interested, we've already mentioned that Ubuntu is used by a lot of other Kubernetes vendors. How much of your time and your team's time is spent kind of making your offering as good as it can be versus helping those vendors make their offerings as good as they can be as well?
Well, to be honest, actually, those are separate teams. So we have a whole operating system team, several teams that just focus on the operating system itself. It's different form factors. We have really good relationships with all of the different public clouds. And I think hand on heart, we can easily say we really don't care whether or not you are using our distribution of Kubernetes or somebody else's distribution of Kubernetes. We will support you as a customer in either setting, as well as support you in terms of some of the open source technology you want to deploy on top of that, whether it's things like Kafka or Postgres or MySQL, in our archives and Debian packages and stuff like that. We already actually support a large number of open source projects, and that's just going to continue as those things get sort of containerized and Kubernetes becomes the natural way to deploy and operate those.
Bearing all that in mind, what, I suppose, your own Kubernetes offering, what and how do you ensure that it offers something over people just using Ubuntu on another vendor?
Right. So there, I think what we focus on is the operational primitives. So the fact that we have the same exact primitive, so the same exact API, if you will, that allows you to then deploy a Kubernetes cluster of any size on any of these different substrates, and that we handle the whole day two operation of it, so the whole lifecycle management, so that you can upgrade when you want to, when you need to. And if you've used some of the public clouds, you know that they have their own cadence for when they upgrade. I don't think any of the public clouds are on 1.14. We were on 1.14 within 2 weeks. And so if that's important to you, if some of those innovations are important to you, then that's one of the ways that we sort of help ensure that our offering is compelling in the users out there for users to leverage, as well as the different form factors of micro-K8. So micro-K8 being a single node cluster. On the roadmap, we'll sort of have the ability to do a clustered micro-K8. So when you think of IoT devices, edge clouds, those are also areas where Ubuntu is very popular, very dominant. Having micro-K8s and supporting our customers to deploy micro-K8s there is sort of natural for us. And then between that and bridging the gap between micro-K8s and CDK, that's what I think a lot of our customers find attractive.
Do you host your offering on your own infrastructure, or are you hosting it on other clouds?
I see what you're saying. So we do have a managed Kubernetes offering. And as part of that managed Kubernetes offering, there is flexibility in terms of where we manage it there. Okay. So it's not exactly a hosted, Kubernetes as a service. Yeah.
And apart from Kubeflow and what are you saying, micro-K8? Micro-K8.
Micro-K8s.
K8s, okay. Yes. Do you have any new features or announcements at the show this year?
No, just in terms of nothing that we haven't already announced as part of our 1904 operating system release, as well as our most recent version of our release of both microK8s and CDK, our charm distribution of Kubernetes, as being sort of the latest and greatest things there. There's some things that we've added in terms of new network plugins. The fact that we're actually on Containerd, so one of the very first distributions to be on Containerd. And there's a few other sort of minor things and enhancements there. But yeah, nothing more dramatic than that.
And what's on the roadmap for the next 6 months? Or year, or whatever?
That we can't talk about too much, other than what we can say is that we're seeing a massive adoption, and to some degree a surprising level of adoption for microK8s. It seems to be infiltrating a lot of different areas. And so on the back of that, we are looking at additional innovations we can do and use cases around microK8s.
Let's dig into that a little bit more, actually, because I'd not heard of it before, but it sounds quite interesting. So this is a developer tool, I guess, that you install locally, or?
Yeah, so think of it as a developer tool and think of it as IoT and Edge. And so what it is, and actually I didn't even go into our Ubuntu core operating system that is all snapped, but it's a snap. Snaps themselves have interesting properties around channels. So you've got, essentially Edge, beta, release candidate, stable release. So you have these different channels. And then with snaps, they're kind of like the applications on your phone. They will automatically upgrade and update if they're within the same major .minor. So if it's a patch release, so when there's a security exploit, these snaps get automatically updated. microK8s is a snap. And all you have to do is sort of say, snap install microK8s, and you have a fully functioning microK8s cloud that also has some functionality around GPUs. That also makes it really easy to create your own registry if you want to contain a registry, if you want to run Istio, if you want to run the dashboard. It has all these kinds of features. And so once you make it easy for people to install, and quite literally with good network connection, you'll have it up and running in 10 seconds. It's hard to get easier than that. Now, if you're not on Ubuntu, we do also have, in beta on all the different operating systems, a technology called multipass. So if you go to multipass.run, you'll see that you can download an application for Windows, for the Mac, for Linux, and with that, you can do something like multipass launch Bionic, and you'll get a virtual machine that is Ubuntu.
Okay, and is that like using Vagrant or Docker or?
Similar Vagrant, but it's not using Docker, it's not using Vagrant. It can use VirtualBox, but it uses the actual native hypervisor. So the Mac has a hypervisor framework, and just recently, Windows Hyper-V. Of course, they're coming out with WSL2, so that'll sort of be a difference in terms of how they do things. But both of those platforms have their own native hypervisor technology. If that doesn't work with you, we'll integrate with things like VirtualBox. But with that, we then use our cloud images. So the exact same images that you're using up in the public clouds, you can use locally. So you can almost think of this as creating your own private cloud on your laptop or workstation. Not only is it the same images, but it also has things like Cloud Init. Cloud Init is a mechanism, think of it as a script, but it's something that you can run on your virtual machine before you actually log in for the first time. So if you actually want to do some final installs, final setups, you can do all that. So you have a user experience that is very similar to what you'd see up in the cloud. You can do that on your laptop with Windows and the Mac. That then gets you into an Ubuntu machine, which you can install microK8s, you can install Kubeflow. You're off to the races.
And with that, so two questions on that. I think one you partially answered already, but the first one is, can I use on the Mac and Windows especially to create a cluster, or is it still only going to be a one instance?
Sure, yeah, you can create a cluster. So multipass, you can spin up as many of these as you want. And then from there, you can kind of do what you need to do. And then with microK8s, once we sort of add clustering to it, if you wanted to sort of emulate, you could sort of create 3 different VMs, microK8s on each one of them, and cluster them together.
And those images, even on Mac and Windows, are exactly the same as the ones I'd be using in production?
Yeah, exactly.
So it's pretty easy to just push somehow.
One of the things that we emphasize, which is, even on your laptop, that is a cloud environment. So when you think of your development pipeline, from your development to staging to production, the more you can make all of that the same, all the way down to the OS and the same kernel, because with containers, they're leveraging some of those kernel mechanisms. The more you make those identical, the fewer surprises you're going to get in production, right?
And you mentioned Edge, so is there a mechanism for me to also be running the similar infrastructure on more restricted devices?
Yeah, and whether you have an edge cloud that substantiates, as an example, running OpenStack and then Kubernetes within OpenStack, or whether or not you have a smaller cloud where you will do Kubernetes directly on bare metal. Let's say if it's 8 servers, or something even smaller, a single node, 3 nodes, and you might use microK8s in that setting. Yeah, that environment at the edge, up in the cloud, in your data center would all be the same.
And was there any reason that you went down this path of creating a new option for this instead of using Docker and VirtualBox and the other options that already are taking advantage of the hypervisors?
Sure, yeah. I think when you look around at the time, there was nothing that leveraged the native. This isn't new. Multipass is new. Okay. But, it is leveraging, so 2 things. One, it's leveraging the actual native hypervisor, which Docker sort of does with Xhive, but it's slightly different, but it's not a virtual machine.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So Docker's going to do a container, but not a VM. VirtualBox does, but then VirtualBox is a separate application. So like on the Mac, if you run this on the Mac and you use a native hypervisor, you'll see that your boot up times are dramatically improved, but then also even the memory and CPU utilization, when you're using it in VirtualBox, it'll actually kind of consume that for you already, which then automatically degrades what it's available to you, versus with the native integration, only as your virtual machine uses more memory will it actually use the real memory on your computer. So there's just small things like that make, I think, a huge difference. When I've had to do these things in the past, I've had to close down a lot of applications on my Mac when I'm using VirtualBox that I now just don't have to do with Multipass and the native integration. But then also, with those other ones, you don't see the integration with our cloud images. So our cloud images are there, they'll get cached automatically, so the user experience side of it is very different. If you go to, as an example, VirtualBox and Vagrant, you'll see that there's lots of different Ubuntu versions, and some of them have Puppet installed and this and that, and who created these. Whereas here, you're getting something that is supported from Canonical, the creators of Ubuntu.
And so this is created by you, though, but did you hope it to become kind of a standard or not?
I think we will see it being used in a lot of different places, and just like microK8s has been taking off like a rocket ship, Multipass is relatively new, and I think we'll see that gain wide adoption. We'll also see with WSL2, we'll see quite a lot of adoption.
I was going to ask about that because I've actually, because Build just happened, I've had a bunch of interviews around WSL recently, so Windows subsystem for Linux. So yeah, in terms of developer workflows, obviously, is that's a supplemental to this? Like it's another option, or? Exactly,
it's another option, and I think you'll find WSL2 being great for certain use cases, and personally I just haven't dove into that yet, and you'll find that that Multipass is great for other use cases. And I think having multiple versions of the actual operating system that you want to run, plus also WS2, it is an Ubuntu kernel, but it's not the same as what you're going to be running up in the cloud, right? So if you're just looking for essentially an Ubuntu shell, then that might be a natural place. If you're looking for more of your own private cloud option, then I think Multipass is going to be much better for you.
I'm Sheng Liang. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Rancher Labs.
And for the people who don't know, what is Rancher Labs?
Rancher Labs is an open source software company. We develop open source software that is an enterprise Kubernetes platform. So by that, we mean we enable organizations to run Kubernetes everywhere.
And I mean, there's obviously a few vendors and offerings that do that. So what do you do that you feel is different and special?
That's a great question. I think it has to kind of start from how we believe the industry will go, and we believe Kubernetes is really going to be the foundational technology that powers majority, if not all, applications on the server side in the future. So when that happens, we believe developers and operations people will just be running Kubernetes everywhere. So it's running Kubernetes is not really just a data center or even a cloud endeavor. It's we're seeing a lot of interest. People run Kubernetes even in branch offices, even on the edge. And on the other side, developers even start to run Kubernetes on the laptop so that they can develop their application and test those applications on the fly in exactly the same environment as production. So if you think about the world in the future where Kubernetes is everywhere, then you almost have to come to terms with it that Kubernetes is not necessarily a piece of technology a single vendor will be able to provide. So for example, there are a lot of vendors here who might specialize in Kubernetes on premise. There might be vendors who specialize in providing Kubernetes as a development tool, and there are companies like Amazon and Google who would be doing Kubernetes as a service in the cloud, right? So I would say, unlike a lot of these folks here who focuses on, in our space, who focuses on providing just a Kubernetes distro and standing up Kubernetes, Rancher Labs, we built a management platform, really spans any Kubernetes cluster, regardless where you get it, who does it, and that we believe now the challenge is no longer on how to install Kubernetes and solving the day one, day two operational problems, but really how to drive Kubernetes adoption massively in an organization, how to make sure that developers can get productive, in this new paradigm, and how to make sure IT organizations can ensure security and compliance. So from Rancher's perspective, multi-cluster is almost the norm, not just multi-namespaces, and almost multi-vendor that provides Kubernetes is also the norm as well. So that's some of the things we do differently from say the likes of Docker EE and Red Hat OpenShift, which are basically in very feature rich and enhanced Kubernetes distros.
So I'm guessing from a developer / user's perspective, you have a command line interface, a GUI, and what providers do you integrate with at the moment?
Great question. So Rancher itself, we do Kubernetes distros as well. That's still that used to be all of our business, but now that's actually becoming a smaller part of our business, less than 50% now. So and we actually have, even in that space, we have two distros. We have a distro called Rancher Kubernetes Engine. That is our mainstream distro today that works in the data center and in the cloud. But we also recently shipped a distro called K3S. That's a small, lightweight Kubernetes distro that was initially developed for edge and branch office use, but we're also seeing tons of interest by developers just running these things on laptops or running them in Raspberry Pis and places like that. So it's been tremendous. But on top of that, Rancher really, as a Kubernetes container management product, really works with any distro. So through Rancher, we can even create like EKS, GKE, AKS clusters for you, and And we can, or if you've already set up a cluster, say you've set up an OpenShift cluster, or you set up a KOps cluster, or you install the cluster manually using kubeadm, we just be able to import it into Rancher and manage it from there. But so hopefully that answers your question. What Kubernetes providers we support?
I feel like you used to also maintain some other tools like Rancher OS and some other things, but do you still do that, or have you changed the model a little bit?
Yeah, we do a bunch of technologies. Rancher OS is there. Rancher OS is a lightweight Linux distro built for the sole purpose of running Docker containers. But the world is changing. So for example, even though today, I would say vast majority of Kubernetes distros manage Docker containers, but looking forward, say our K3S Kubernetes distro actually only manages container D, because Docker is actually a little bit too heavyweight for being just a container runtime. Because when you install Docker, it comes with Swarm and all that kind of stuff, whether you need it or not, right? So in that sense, we've actually created a new lightweight operating system distro called K3OS. So that is a Kubernetes distro, K3S, and a Linux distro combined in one. That's very interesting because it makes it so easy to operate Kubernetes, so you don't have to upgrade and patch and maintain the operating system image separately from the Kubernetes distro. So we still have a project like that, and we have a bunch of other things. Just today, actually, we announced a project called Rio, like as in Rio de Janeiro, RIO, and the thing, Rio is a micro PaaS platform. So it's similarly along the lines of you remember early days of Docker. There were platforms like Deus and Flint. Yeah. It's similar to that, except it's built on Kubernetes. It uses all the latest technology. It actually comes with it the Istio service mesh and Knative, PaaS platform, and it has a very, very simple interface, actually very similar to it's almost as easy to use as Docker, but then you have the whole power of Kubernetes and Istio and Knative underneath, right? So it's almost a new take on micro PaaS. It's not a traditional PaaS in the sense that it's a gigantic platform out there that every developer has to tether to it. This is something that's very lightweight, and wherever you have Kubernetes already running, whether it's on a laptop for a developer or it's in a data center or it's a GKE cluster, you can just overlay Rio on it, and you'll be able to deploy and manage and upgrade your applications very easily.
Okay, so just to dig into a little bit more detail there, because that was going to be my next question. So Rio is something you will add on top of... Okay. And for predominantly saying application management, or for other purposes as well?
So, if I tell you its capabilities, it'll be more obvious. So it has it does things like deploy, create microservices or apps, web services from containers. So you kind of run a replica set, right? It's like a bit of like a serverless kind of experience. I have a bunch of containers and just turn them into services and expose them through as a web URL. It automatically creates, let's encrypt certificates. So takes care of all the SSL certificates. It has route. That's actually a Knative feature, right? You can so it has intelligent. It has intelligent load balancing effectively built in, and then it has all the service mesh capabilities. That means you get all the stats, you get auto scaling, you get you get these sophisticated upgrade mechanisms like Canary. So I can roll out a new version of the service gradually over time as they, as these services pass my acceptance test, and if something goes wrong, I can roll back. So it is. I think it is the sort of thing that people always expected a PaaS platform to be able to do, except now with the power of Kubernetes and Istio and Knative, it really gives a new spin to PaaS, and PaaS is no longer as heavyweight as it used to be, and it actually, you can almost carry around with it. Now it's, PaaS, historically, I always look at PaaS as something as an evolution of middleware in some sense, right? But now I look at Rio, it's actually almost beginning to look more like an app server because it's something you can kind of carry with you.
Is this exclusively a commercial service from you, or is it also an open source? Okay.
It's 100% open source software that you can deploy on any Kubernetes cluster. Everything we do as a company, everything we do is open source software.
And I guess you make income from sort of a certain level of service, or how do you make income? Yeah.
So our business model is as Rancher users start to put our software in production, they generally come to Rancher and procure a subscription. So it's very similar to the Red Hat model, where you would, even though the software is free, itself is free, and the source code is freely available, right? And they're effectively getting that assurance and support and peace of mind, and from a vendor, so that they can run these applications in production reliably and securely.
Apart from Rio, do you have any other announcements or news at the show this year?
Not specifically at this show. There's so much going on at this show, but this year we've had so many things just that happened in the last 6 months. So for just to refresh, I think early this year we shipped a major release of Rancher called 2.2, and it had a big focus for Rancher 2.2 is to really enable something called multi-cluster applications. So, Kubernetes is think about it. Most people would deploy applications onto a single Kubernetes cluster, right? And Kubernetes cluster is supposed to be distributed. But what we saw was as people start to run Kubernetes across a wide geographic distribution, like you have multiple data centers, a lot of people don't necessarily run a single cluster across multiple regions or even multiple availability zones. They actually prefer to keep the blast radius of Kubernetes a little smaller, and then they actually create Kubernetes clusters that reside in its own availability zone. So in that sense, now if I want to deploy a highly resilient application, that means I'm going to have to deploy copies of the same application across multiple Kubernetes clusters. Then I have to tie the ingress traffic together so that they go through some common load balancer or DNS, and I have to tie the backend access to database together. So Rancher 2.2 supports that. That was a very because we've been doing a multi-cluster management for a while, and multi-cluster application is just a natural progression of that. And then we announced another piece of technology very, very closely related to this called Submariner. It is a piece of networking technology that connects.
It allows people to have fun project names.
That's awesome. Yeah, so that connects pods. That creates a seamless network, layer 3 network connectivity between pods in different clusters. So I just use that multi-cluster application as an example. Imagine if you deploy a Cassandra cluster across, because Cassandra is designed to run in a geographically distributed environment, right? So if I deploy Cassandra across, say, 2 Kubernetes clusters, but then my Cassandra nodes in these 2 clusters have to talk to each other, and it would have been very difficult without Submariner. With Submariner, they can connect to each other directly. Without Submariner, I'm actually not even sure it's possible, because then you'd have to essentially traverse out to the internet and maybe back in through an ingress controller or something. It would be very complicated. So Submariner is being very successful. It's actually a vibrant community. Yeah, but it's becoming a community project. Like folks from Red Hat and stuff, they're actually contributing to it. So that's very good. It's only like 3 months old, and then we created a project called K3S. I explained it. It's a lightweight Kubernetes distro, and then K3S is kind of given birth to a series of projects closely related. There's K3S on Docker called K3D. There's K3S based operating system called K3OS. So I mean, Kubernetes space is fascinating. Have you? Last time I went to KubeCon in the keynote, and I heard someone say Kubernetes is becoming boring and it is good. And I think they meant good, because they meant like Kubernetes is not stable. Yeah. But I kind of took it and said, no, Kubernetes is not boring at all. There's so many... ecosystem. Yeah. So many new things are happening, right? Like again, Kubernetes. I don't think Kubernetes as is actually even sufficient to be successful. You actually need all these things coming from the ecosystem, all these add-on projects, right? So we're having a great time launching these projects.
I mean, we just have to look here. I've already had 3 interviews and heard so many different additions and ecosystem components that I hadn't even heard of before.
No, it's really the most vibrant ecosystem I've ever seen.
And just one other quick question. The name, is that from like the pets and cattle thing?
That's right. Yeah. We Shannon and I, we actually started a company in 2008 called Cloud.com, and we created a piece of software called CloudStack. It predated OpenStack a little bit, but very similar. We're very successful building, infrastructure as a service clouds. It's open source software. It's Apache CloudStack. So we had a history doing this kind of stuff, and pets versus cattle always resonated with us, and I think really like the way I want to tie it back to our view of Kubernetes, because our view of Kubernetes is really, it is the common infrastructure, because for this cattle paradigm to work, cattle really had to be commodity. Like even though like you can, like Amazon will tell you Amazon's great, but they say you can manage these EC2 instances as cattle. It is true, but it's a very special kind of cattle. It's the kind of cattle you can only procure from one vendor, right? So it's not really cattle. It's almost like only UK produces that cattle, and no other country can produce it. That would be very strange, right? Oh, this farm produced this cattle. So it's a bit like that. So we always felt, as good as these cloud resources were as cattle, they weren't real cattle. They weren't real commodity. And that's why when we saw Kubernetes, I was like, that could be it, because Kubernetes clusters actually sounded like the new cattle. If you, because honestly, there's a lot less difference between, think about it, like if you look at a EC2 instance against a GCP or like Azure instance, they're kind of similar, but they're not really exchangeable. They're not really a commodity, right? Whereas if you look at a GKE cluster versus a EKS cluster, they're almost like a commodity. They look a lot more similar. And then people used to say, oh, it's one thing that you have commoditized compute, but what about these cloud services? Like RDS, like these services are going to tie you down. So you still, they're not really commodity. But then if you look at the Kubernetes ecosystem, you look at everyone now actually make their solutions natively work with Kubernetes. So once your like Lightstep, or you take Datadog, just anything like Aqua Security, JFrog, CloudBees, they work everywhere, right? I think now, I would think it's almost like Kubernetes clusters, almost like the new commoditized infrastructure, and that's why, like, that's actually how we said, okay, we want to make.
So it's more like a ranch than a cow.
Yeah. So we make that's why we want to be rancher, right? We want to be something that's coordinating and managing all those resources, help our customers do that, and it is. I think it's just a much better way for IT to manage everything, to be productive and to be efficient.
And finally, I'm hoping as an open source company, you're happy to share this. What are you working on? What's next on the roadmap in the next 6 months to a year?
Yeah, so we're working. We're very open about this kind of stuff. So we're gonna productize things like K3S, K3OS, and Real. Because right now these things are all just really like tech preview alpha quality products, right? So we're gonna turn them into beta and turn them into a release, and we're gonna also start working on a cloud service. So one thing we've realized was today we have a lot of partners that's actually taking Rancher and running it as a service, and then we as a company has been offering just a commercial license to essentially support our own software, right? But that has some limitations because we couldn't really serve everyone that needed our help. It's just the traditional software subscription model has a very high entry barrier. Yeah. So we're looking now. Our software is getting to be better. We're looking for ways so that we can run it more efficiently, and then we can serve more of our customers at a lower cost, and so they don't have to run it themselves. Today, a vast majority of Rancher open source users don't get our commercial service. Only about 1% of our total open source users actually become a Rancher subscriber. So I think with a cloud service, with a SaaS service, with some kind of online service coming from Rancher, that ratio could go a little higher. So that's one of the things we're working on. But it's not easy. It's actually incredibly difficult to create an experience that is very easy to use. So we have a lot of work to do.
And that was my 3 interviews from KubeCon so far. First up, you heard IBM's Jason McGee. Second, you heard Canonical's Carmine Rimi. And finally, you heard from Rancher Labs' Sheng Liang. If you've enjoyed the show, you can find notes and previous episodes at christianschiller.com/podcasts, and the newsletters that accompany this podcast at christianschiller.com/newsletters. You can reach out to me on Twitter at chrischinch, or find other contact details on the same website I've mentioned twice already. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate, review, share, and until next time, if you have been, thank you very much for listening.